This is going to be a relatively brief analysis of the last 100 pages of Birdsong. It's by no means an exhaustive list of quotations, themes, and characters, and I would recommend that you take these ideas and use them to add to your own notes for the last 100 pages of the novel. Neither am I going to work entirely chronologically. Instead, I'm going to deal with each character or theme in turn, and go chronologically like that instead. The page numbers listed here are from the 2 copies that we've been using in class. I'm going to start with Elizabeth and then just one word from Jian. And in this section, Elizabeth's penultimate section in the novel, this is very much about Elizabeth trying to make a connection with the past. So it's about modern society, but it's also about remembrance, and it's also about regeneration and renewal. It says on page 410, again, she had touched the past. It had stopped being history and had turned into experience. This is after Elizabeth has met with Gray and met with Brennan and called Gray on the phone. And I think this line is Falk's way of showing us the naivety of modern society in terms of its attempts at remembrance. She had touched the past, it had stopped being history and had turned into experience. Well, it has turned into her experience in a way, but it is also a long, long way from the experience of the soldiers that she has just encountered. And so her belief that she has turned it into living experience highlights the inability of modern society to truly connect with the experiences of those who lived through World War I. And that's confirmed on page 414 when it says, in her generation, there was no intensity. This is about the gap of experience between those two worlds. But at least Elizabeth, more than any other character in these sections of the novel, is making some meaningful attempt to connect with the past and to engage in true and meaningful remembrance. So it's a reminder from Falks to his reader that this is possible and it is worthwhile. It says somehow she would repay the debt, she would complete the circle. And that metaphor is one that Elizabeth uses a number of times later in the later stages of the novel. After she gives birth, there's a suggestion that she has completed the circle. And then interestingly, it is Elizabeth's pregnancy which gives her vitality and life in the novel. It says the blue line, this is the pregnancy test on page 419, the blue line across each was firm and assertive. It was not just positive, it was bursting with life. Just like Isabel at the end of part 1, it is pregnancy which gives Elizabeth independence, vitality, and purpose. And in fact, it is in many ways the female characters in the novel, as poorly as they're sometimes written by folks, it is the female characters who are the figures of regeneration and renewal in so many ways. It is through the birth of Elizabeth's son that she completes the circle and allows Stephen to maintain and keep his promise that he makes to Jack in the tunnel before Jack dies. And Jian similarly confirms to Stephen on page 431 that nothing is beyond redemption. Again, it is the female characters in so many ways who are the figures of hope, and certainly the figures of regeneration and renewal in the novel. And then we come to the moment that Elizabeth gives birth, and this is about 2 pages from the end of the novel. It says, then Elizabeth opened her eyes, and he saw, this is Robert, he saw them fill with a determination he had never seen in any human face before. She threw back her head, and he could see the sinews of her neck rise up like bones. Her wild eyes reminded him of a horse that has finally scented home and clamps his teeth onto the metal bit. No power on earth could stop this combined force of muscle, instinct, and willpower as it drove on to its appointed end. Now, whatever we think about this description of Elizabeth, and it is in many ways problematic, certainly in the way that he relates Elizabeth to the horse, and the animalistic nature of it. But there is also an immense vitality in this description. And there is also this kind of relentless, unstoppable force that we see. So Elizabeth, through the act of giving birth, becomes one of the most powerful figures in the novel, because it is her, like the other women in the novel, who provide hope for the future, who provide a sense of life and vitality and purpose and regeneration. It is those female characters who ensure that generations continue and that the war was not entirely futile. A little bit on remembrance now, and in many of the texts that I teach, I find it very hard to pick out my favorite line or my favorite quotation. But in Birdsong, I find it straightforward, and it's this line here on page 422. Elizabeth is reading Stephen's notebook, which has been translated for her. And it finishes, the final line we get from the notebook is, "We will seal what we have seen in the silence of our hearts, and no words will reach us." Now, I love this line, not only because it's beautifully written, but also because it offers you an enormous amount in terms of analysis and technique. I think in the sibilants here and in the assonance of this line, it gives the statement an enduring quality and almost a sense of timelessness, but also a sense of distance. So there's this idea that the pain and suffering of the soldiers will continue forevermore, but it will continue inside of them. And by creating that sense of distance in the sibilants and the assonance, Folks confirms that we will forever be distanced from the experiences of the soldiers in World War I. There is no possibility, as Stephen confirms here, of us ever truly understanding, because we can never get close to what they experienced, but also the men are unable to express what they, either unable or unwilling to express what they experienced during World War I. The world they endured there is so far detached from the world that they re-entered and any future generation that it would be futile for them to try and express what they experienced, because we couldn't possibly understand. It's telling that from that final line of Elizabeth's penultimate section, we transition, and it's interesting to look at the transitions from each part to the next. The start of the next section, which is back in Stephen's world, is Stephen put away his pen and notebook, as if to confirm that Stephen has no desire and the other soldiers have no desire to relate to us the truth of their experiences, because they know we cannot possibly understand. And that is confirmed when Stephen and Gray are in conversation on page 427. And Gray says to Stephen, "Think of the words on that memorial, Raceford. Think of those stinking towns and foul bloody villages whose names will be turned into some bogus glory by fat-arsed historians who have sat in London." And that little two-word phrase, bogus glory, I think is the one you can take out of here. Because folks is confirming to us that even before the end of the war, the soldiers have an understanding that we can never possibly remember in any appropriate way what went on the battlefields of World War I. The bogus glory is the way in which it is proleptic of the way in which future generations will glorify the horrors of World War One. And in that glorification is a complete inability to truly comprehend the horrors of what happened there. A quick look at Jack now. There's lots about Jack in this final section, and I'm just going to pick out a few sections here which I think are important. When Stephen and Jack get buried underground by the explosion in the tunnel, the first line of that section is Jack Firebrace entombed in his heavy burial place. And that word entombed, I think, is important because it has religious connotations that paint Jack here as another one of the Christ-like sacrificial figures in the novel. But increasingly through this section, it is telling that Jack loses his connection with God. He gradually loses the religious belief that has been so strong earlier in the novel. Jack's religious faith stayed with him even beyond Horrocks the padre, the priest. He had lost his religious belief, but Jack still had his. Even when he learns that his son John has died, he still maintains his religious belief. That's how strong it was. But even for Jack, in the horrors of this world, he cannot hold on to his religious faith. It says, there was no consideration beyond the body in the darkness of the tunnel. What was done by them in the earth with their hands and legs and voices was the boundary of it all. It's important that this takes place in a tunnel again. The tunnels are metaphorically a symbol of transition in the novel, a transition from one state of being to another. And Jack is transitioning here, not just from a state of life to a state of death, but also from a state of belief to a state of non-belief. A man who previously embodied the spirituality of religious faith now seems to embody the physicality that we had previously associated with Stephen earlier in the novel. There is no consideration beyond the body, and human existence is the boundary of it all. There is no hope of afterlife here for Jack, and because of that, on page 472, the important line when Jack says, "Get me off this cross." Now we are first introduced to Jack when it says Jack Firebrace was supported by a wooden cross. He is introduced as the Christ-like sacrificial figure, but here he refuses to be that anymore because he has lost his religious faith. And his death is symptomatic of that. His laughter turned into a cough and then into a spasm that lifted up his chest into Stephen's arms. The hacking, rattling sound filled the narrow space, then stopped. Jack let out a long final exhalation as all the breath left him, and his body fell back in the end he had wanted. This seems to me to be an intensely physical death, spasm, hacking, rattling. And it is important that it says the breath left him, not the spirit. This seems to be an entirely physical ending for a man who has been left devoid of religious and spiritual faith, and his body falls back to the earth instead of his soul ascending to heaven. So Jack Firebrace, who started off as this sacrificial figure, has ended as a sacrificial figure, but not one who brings us any hope of regeneration and renewal, because of course his son has died. And so there ends Jack's story as a human being. And it is left instead to Stephen, seemingly the most unlikely of candidates at the start of the novel, to carry this message of regeneration and renewal. He transitions from this entirely physical being into a spiritual one who is able to offer us hope for the future. There were no distinct worlds, only one creation to which he was bound by the beating of his blood. Pulse and beating have been important motifs throughout the novel. And here, I think the beating of Stephen's blood is as vital and as important and as tangible as it has been anywhere in the novel. And the plosives in this line, bound by the beating of his blood, give him a vitality and a purpose, which means he is going to be the figure of regeneration at the end of the novel. And then tellingly on page 439, he could feel his heart moving slowly against his ribs. It's as if his life is just beginning here. And it's one of the few times in the novel that we hear mention of Stephen's heart. Lots of mentions of beating and blood and pulse, but here it is his heart that is moving. He is more alive than he has ever been. And it is perhaps because of that, his awareness of his life now, his awareness of being alive, that means he almost envies the men who are dying. It says, as though the earth had wrapped him in heavy, comfortable blankets. And that simile, combined with the metaphor there, reveals the comfort and safety that Stephen would feel in death, because he's now more aware of his life than he's ever been before. And because of that, he has become a human being more than ever with the capacity to feel. And as he feels, he becomes aware of fear and pain. And that is perhaps why he is so desirous of death at this moment. It says he envied the men who were dying, the peaceful exhalation, breath and spirit gone. And so Stephen's ending, when he comes out of the tunnel and he meets Levi, the German whose brother he has killed, it says, far beyond thought, the resolution came to him, and he found his arms still raised begin to spread and open. Well, of course, Stephen is opening his arms out wide here in the figure of the cross. He becomes the Christ-like figure at the end of the novel. But unlike Jack, Stephen is that figure who offers us hope and redemption and a future after the horror of warfare. Levi also comes out. He looked at this wild-eyed figure, half demented, his brother's killer. Stephen's almost the perfect Christ-like figure here, because there's nothing pure, there's nothing particularly spiritual about him. In fact, he's a wild-eyed figure. He's almost monstrous. This is spirituality, but it is spirituality in a world which has been entirely reshaped. It doesn't look like Christ. It doesn't look like a sacrificial figure that we might expect, because this is a new world, a different world. But Levi also, it says, he opened his own arms in turn, and the two men fell upon each other's shoulders, weeping at the bitter strangeness of their human lives. And that final phrase there, their human lives, not just their lives. Folks is very careful here to stress human lives, because this is a restarting of humanity after a time where all humanity has been entirely stripped away. Everything we knew previously has been stripped away. Humanity starts again from this moment. And Stephen's final line in the novel, the final line about him in his final section, his body and his mind were tired beyond speech and beyond repair, but nothing could check the low exultation of his soul. I think it's really important to note that the final word attached to Stephen in the novel is soul. Stephen has discovered a spirituality through warfare, and in that spirituality is a hope that things can continue, that things can happen after this moment, not only after this moment, but after his death. There is the possibility of redemption and renewal in Stephen's final moments in the novel. So then we come to the ending, the final page. And when I first read this, I'd invested so much in this novel. I absolutely adore the novel. And it made me feel intensely, actually, for these characters and for the events. And I hated this ending when I first read it, because I thought, how could folks, after all of that, give Robert the final moment in the novel? But as I've read it and reread it, actually, I think this is an appropriate ending for this wonderful book. Robert, it says, he threw the conkers into the air in his great happiness. In the tree above him they disturbed a roosting crow, which erupted from the branches with an explosive bang of its wings, then rose above him towards the sky, its harsh, ambiguous call coming back in long, grating waves towards the earth, to be heard by those still living. Well, the conkers are like a seed here, so they act again as a final symbol of regeneration and renewal. But this is not a comfortable, smooth regeneration and renewal. They disturbed a roosting crow. There is still conflict between man and nature. The words erupted and explosive bang are in the semantic field of warfare. So there's a reminder that even in this moment of happiness in the modern world, the horrors of warfare cannot be left behind. And then folks leaves us with that again, that final phrase, by those still living. It is a reminder to us, the reader, of the privilege of our current existence. And it is a privilege because we owe that existence to the men who sacrificed so much during World War I. So it's a final reminder from the author of our need to remember correctly and properly, and to remember as best we can. But this is not going to be a comfortable world. We need to be reminded constantly of what has gone before, so that we can make the world that we are living in a better place. So I think it's a really fit and proper and also important ending for the novel. It's not about Robert at all. It's about us. I hope that's been a useful recap of the last 100 pages. As I said, I would go back and think about those ideas and look at those last 100 pages in a little bit more detail.